Good morning. The 9,887th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation concerning the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Angola, Burundi, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Rwanda to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. On behalf of the Council, I welcome His Excellency Mr. Olivier Nduhungirehe, Minister of Foreign Affairs of International Corporations of Rwanda. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following to participate in the meeting: Ms. Bintou Keita, Special Representative of the Secretary-General and Head of the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Ms. Charlotte Slente, Secretary-General of the Danish Refugee Council. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of its agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2025/176, the report of the Secretary-General on the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I now give the floor to Ms. Bintou Keita.
Madame la Présidente, distingués membres.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Your Excellency, Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Rwanda, Your Excellency, Permanent Representative of the DRC to the United Nations, Your Excellency, Permanent Representative of Angola, Your Excellency, Permanent Representative of Burundi. I would like to thank you for this opportunity to discuss the alarming situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and MONUSCO's unswerving efforts to implement its mandate despite considerable challenges. The political and security context remains very tense owing to the expansion in the east of the DRC of the Alliance Fleuve Congo, the AFC, and the Mouvement du 23 Mars, the M23, supported by the Rwandan Defense Forces. This has prompted the Security Council to hold emergency sessions on the 26th and 28th of January, as well as on the 19th of February. This resulted in the adoption on the 21st of February of Resolution 2773. As for the Human Rights Council, on the 7th of February, the HRC convened an extraordinary session on the human rights situation in the east of the DRC, which resulted in the adoption of resolution document reference RES/S/37/1, which created a fact-finding mission recently formed, as well as an independent commission of inquiry on serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law committed in North Kivu and South Kivu from January 2022 onwards. This initiative reinforces similar efforts that have been undertaken by the International Criminal Court to address crimes committed in North Kivu throughout this period.
President, distinguished members of the Council, in February and March, the AFC M23, backed by the Rwandan Defense Forces, advanced further in North and South Kivu. By mid-March, it had consolidated its control over Ijwi territory and several chiefdoms in the Uvira Highlands in South Kivu, while also continuing its expansion into Walikale territory in North Kivu. Today, AFC M23 controls large parts of both provinces, North Kivu and South Kivu, and threatens to expand into Chopo and Maniema provinces. AFC M23 also continued installing a parallel administration, appointing most recently a governor, 2 vice-governors and a mayor in Bukavu in South Kivu. In North Kivu, AFC M23 has appointed financial administrators and a mining delegate, echoing links between armed conflicts and the illegal exploitation of natural resources in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Despite extensive regional and international efforts, the immediate and unconditional ceasefire called for by the East African Community, the South African Development Community, the African Union, Security Council Resolution 2773, and most recently under the auspices of Qatar, is yet to materialize. It is imperative that all parties honor their stated commitment to silence the guns and pursue a peaceful solution. I would like to express my gratitude to Angolan President and African Union Chair, President João Lourenço, for his tireless mediation efforts aimed at restoring dialogue between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda. I encourage the swift appointment of an African Union mediator to spearhead the panel of facilitators appointed by the joint ESC-SADC Summit of Heads of States with a view to coordinating and unifying the mediation initiatives building on the foundations of the Luanda and Nairobi processes. The overall security situation in the rest of North Kivu and Ituri, where over 60% of MONUSCO forces are deployed, remains also volatile. The Allied Democratic Forces, ADF, have exploited the security vacuum created by the redeployment of the FRDC troops to launch attacks in Lubero, Beni, and near Butembo, killing hundreds of civilians. In Ituri, alongside the ADF threat, clashes between Codeco and Zaire armed groups have escalated, particularly in Djougou and Mahagi territories. These groups have targeted civilians near mining areas, farmland, and internally displaced person sites. The announcement by former International Criminal Court convict Thomas Lubanga of a new politico-military movement, Convention pour la Révolution Populaire, CRP, in Ituri, also threatens civilians and regional security. Madame la Présidente,
Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, the human rights situation is getting much, much worse. Over the last few months, in the province of North Kivu, we've seen the highest number of human rights violations and abuses to date. These cases of serious abuses targeting civilians include summary executions of over 100 people, as well as abductions and forced recruitment of young people, including children, in addition to circumscription and forced labor. In Ituri, ADF and Codeco are continuing to commit abuses, aggravating a human rights situation that is already alarming. Women and children remain the main victims in North Kivu and in Ituri, with serious violations of the rights of the child affecting 403 children, including of which 90 girls, and this between the 1st of December 2024 and the 28th of February of this year. These violations include abductions, murders, mutilations, forced recruitment, attacks on schools, as well as sexual violence. The AFC M23 offensive, through confrontations with the FARDC, has resulted in mass displacement, as well as an influx of combatants and escaped prisoners. All of this has heightened the vulnerability of girls and women to conflict-related sexual violence. The Joint Human Rights Office has reported on hundreds of cases of such violence in North Kivu, in South Kivu, and in Ituri. Impunity breeds recidivism. It is therefore absolutely essential to systematically document these cases so as to guarantee that all victims get justice and reparations. The humanitarian situation in the eastern provinces remains critical. We've seen a dramatic rise in humanitarian needs. Clashes with the M23 have compelled hundreds of thousands of civilians to flee. Displaced communities are often subjected to pressure to go back to whence they came, although security conditions there are not adequate. Humanitarian access remains restricted in various areas due to insecurity and the presence of armed groups. The lengthy closure of the Goma and Kavumu airports is a serious obstacle to the delivery of aid. The fact that the banking sector is not operational in areas under de facto authority is also complicating the humanitarian response, as well as the lives of people in general. In Ituri, the upsurge in attacks committed by armed groups, as well as clashes between these groups and the Uganda People's Defence Force, the UPDF, have exacerbated violence against civilians, increasing humanitarian needs and complicating access. Since January, over 100,000 people have been forced to flee in Jugu territory alone. This deterioration of the situation is occurring against a global context of a financing crisis. The 2025 Humanitarian Response Plan is, for the time being, only 8.2% funded, compelling humanitarian actors to engage in extreme priority setting.
Mrs. President, distinguished members of the Council, in this challenging context, MONUSCO remains fully committed to implementing its mandate as set out in Security Council Resolution 2765. The mission has intensified patrols and established mobile operating bases in Loda and Aar. It has also been facilitating government-led consultation with armed groups in Ituri since January 25, leading to the surrender of 2,216 Zaire elements, the handover of 103 weapons and ammunition, as well as a reduction in security alerts. MONUSCO continues to protect civilians responding to attacks in Jugu territory, providing temporary shelter and assisting with medical evacuations. In North Kivu, MONUSCO has strengthened cooperation with authorities by donating vehicles and enhancing joint patrols, reducing armed criminality. The arrival of the new force commander on 10 February 25 and the establishment of a temporary force headquarters in Beni have bolstered coordination with the FRDC, notably in ADF hotspots areas. In Goma and other areas under the M23's control, MONUSCO continues to face restrictions on its freedom of movement, including roadblocks and a 48-hour notification requirement for convoys. The mission continues to engage with the AFC M23 on matters related to the implementation of its core mandated responsibilities, urging respect for international law, including humanitarian law and the Security Council mandates. In recent days, some restrictions on the movement of MONUSCO in and around Goma have been eased. For instance, M23 is temporarily allowing United Nations vehicles and equipment to cross the border into the Democratic Republic of Congo and permitting civilian personnel to cross over 1 day per week. In Goma, the mission has been able to resupply its bases with MONUSCO military escorts. Mrs. President, distinguished members of the Council, I'm concerned that the ongoing violence in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo is undermining the country's national cohesion. As more people flee the Democratic Republic of Congo eastern provinces to government-controlled areas in the west, disinformation labeling them as infiltrators or suspect of is spreading, in particular on social media. Attacks, albeit isolated, against Tutsi and Swahili-speaking Congolese citizens, along with the resurgence of hate speech, undermine social cohesion. I urge the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo to intensify its effort to combat hate speech by adopting the recently resubmitted law against tribalism, racism and xenophobia, to hold accountable those responsible, and to continue to affirm the diversity of its people. I reiterate the mission's commitment to accompany all actors' efforts to promote social cohesion and prevent the spread of hate speech in the Democratic Republic of Congo and the wider Great Lakes region. Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, MONUSCO remains determined to support regional peace initiatives underway. I encourage all regional peace initiatives to adopt a gender-sensitive approach. I welcome the appointment of 2 women to the joint SADC-EAC facilitator panel. Furthermore, it's vital for the Nairobi process to take into consideration the needs of female combatants in armed groups. As per Resolution 2746, MONUSCO has continued to support SAMI-RDC troops, providing them with logistical assistance and facilitating medevacs, as well as the repatriation of soldiers fallen in the line of duty. The mission also stands ready to make available for its capacities for the implementation of a future ceasefire. The dramatic deterioration of the security situation in the east of the country has had a major impact on discussions between MONUSCO and the Congolese authorities about the gradual and responsible disengagement of the mission as well as the transition in South Kivu. The implementation of the South Kivu government's provincial transition roadmap has been suspended after the AFC M23 seized Bukavu. The joint working group's efforts, the working group being made up of the government, MONUSCO, and the UN country team, their efforts with a view to setting planning modalities and mission disengagement from North Kivu and Ituri have also been compromised because various planning scenarios are now outdated. Nonetheless, the mission would like to reaffirm its determination to continue disengagement talks as well as talks on the transition together with the government.
Distinguished members of the Council, we must direct all our efforts towards securing an unconditional ceasefire. Implementing Resolution 2773 is crucial to ease the suffering of affected populations and to maintain the Democratic Republic of Congo's sovereignty and territorial integrity. I reiterate MONUSCO's readiness to support its implementation. I call on the Council to take concrete measures against those responsible for serious human rights violations and complicity. Furthermore, I reiterate that lasting peace in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo can only be achieved through a political solution. I encourage all parties to recommit to dialogue within regional peace processes and ensure women's participation in negotiations. Lastly, I recall the necessity of the urgent reopening of Goma and Kavumu airports, which are lifelines for humanitarian efforts and key to the rotation of MONUSCO's troops. I strongly call on all parties to respect their obligations to protect civilians in full compliance with international humanitarian and human rights law. Thank you for your attention.
I thank Ms. Keita for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Charlotte Slinte.
Madam President, Excellencies, the Danish Refugee Council has been working in the Democratic Republic of Congo for over 16 years, including in North Kivu and Ituri provinces. As a humanitarian organization which specializes in forced displacement, we are also delivering aid in neighboring countries, Burundi, Tanzania, and Uganda, as well as in 40 other countries across the globe. This year's explosion of violence in and around Goma has exacerbated the already dire humanitarian situation in the east and led to 660,000 people being forcibly displaced. This is in addition to the 6.7 million people that were already displaced across the country at the end of last year. The Danish Refugee Council is among the organizations racing to respond to the erratic and constant movement of IDPs seeking safety since the end of January. IDP sites around Goma were dismantled within 72 hours, forcing IDPs to return to unsafe areas or head to Goma without shelter, without food or water. With little notice, families were kicked out of their shelters, forced to leave with nothing but the clothes they were wearing. Nearly half of those newly displaced are now living in informal sites, including makeshift camps, churches, and schools. 3 new informal sites hosting over 400 households have formed on the outskirts of Goma in the last 3 weeks. Overcrowding is an issue, and living conditions are appalling. Internally displaced girls and boys are traumatized, they are not going to school, and are resorting to begging or looking for odd jobs in exchange for food. We have heard reports of girls engaging in survival sex. The other half of the new IDPs live with host families in Goma, which often do not have the resources to support them. Just over 2 weeks ago, the Danish Refugee Council's field teams spoke to nearly 400 IDPs across 11 informal sites. 96% of people do not feel safe. One person told us, and I quote, "There's nowhere to go. The only solution is to stay in the warehouse and wait to die." DRC knows of widespread looting, shootings at night, and arbitrary arrests, many of whom are wrongly accused of being affiliated with armed groups. There are also reports of boys and men being forced into join armed groups. The presence of armed group members in and around Goma, as well as throughout North Kivu, is further terrorizing those displaced. One person told us that they wake each morning to find new dead bodies on the streets where they're staying, and it's never clear who the perpetrators are. Every step is fraught with danger, as the surrounding area of Goma is extensively contaminated by unexploded ordnances, which is yet another risk to those forcibly displaced that seek safety. Sexual violence is rampant. The Danish Refugee Council provides individual case management in informal sites in and around Goma to individuals who have experienced human rights violations. Since the surge in violence in late January, 98% of these cases have been for rape, including girls younger than 5 years of age. Every single child case management involved rape, further underscoring the extreme risks faced by girls and boys in this conflict. As horrifying as these figures are, we know these are a fraction of the actual number, as most cases go unreported due to fear of retaliation, stigma, and lack of access to specialized services. The humanitarian response is under extreme pressure. Some humanitarian organizations fear retaliation for providing aid in areas not controlled by the government, or are unsure whether they are legally still able to operate there. We lack fuel, cash, and supplies due to looting and the closure of Goma Airport, which is normally a strategic humanitarian hub in eastern Congo. The situation is further complicated by political instability, as local administrative offices which humanitarian organizations engage with are no longer under the control of the Congolese government. This requires navigating new requirements and renegotiating safe access. Banks in Goma are still closed, leading to a lack of cash and creating an environment where mobile money agents are exploiting the situation by arbitrarily dictating their own rates. The sudden and drastic funding cuts in humanitarian aid to DR Congo announced earlier this year as part of broader cuts have further significantly curtailed the ability of organizations to respond to the worsening humanitarian situation across the country. We must not forget that the situation in the northern province of Ituri also remains critical, with limited presence of humanitarian NGOs there. The Danish Refugee Council anticipates that the displacement crisis in DR Congo will only worsen. Our AI-driven forecasting tool, developed alongside IBM, anticipates that DR Congo will be one of the biggest displacement hotspots for the year ahead. Since the escalation of violence in January, 70,000 refugees have arrived in Burundi. This influx is overwhelming the existing transit centers and refugee camps in Burundi, which were already at full capacity. In late February, we conducted a rapid needs assessment along the border between DR Congo and Burundi, which highlighted the urgent need for emergency assistance. Congolese from Goma also fled to Uganda since January. The regional impact will only increase if the humanitarian needs are not addressed within Eastern Congo and the conflict does not end. The Danish Refugee Council calls on members of the Security Council and the international community to, firstly, use all available avenues to guarantee the safe passage and protection of displaced populations in and around Goma. This includes calling for an end to the forced return of displaced people to unsafe areas and ensuring that all returns are voluntary, safe, and dignified. Secondly, call for the unimpeded humanitarian access to displaced populations, including in non-government controlled areas, and for the protection of civilians to be prioritized in all response efforts. Thirdly, urge all parties to find peaceful means to end the conflict, as there are no military solutions to end this violence. And fourthly, support local peace-building efforts to rebuild trust and social cohesion amongst local communities that have been torn apart by years of war. When conditions improve and allow for displaced people to voluntarily and safely begin to return to their villages, it will be critical to help them rebuild their lives. For nearly all of the IDPs the Danish Refugee Council recently interviewed, only peace will make them feel safer. I want to leave you with the word of one of the IDPs we just spoke to, and who said, "We want to go home where we'll be safe, where we can farm our lands and find enough food to eat." Thank you.
I thank Ms. Slente for her briefing. I'll now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to thank the Special Representative of the Secretary-General, Ms. Bintou Keita, for her briefing, but particularly for her action and for the work of MONUSCO in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I thank the Secretary-General of the Danish Refugee Council, Ms. Charlotte Slente, for her briefing, which was incredibly human and tangible. Through these statements, we have taken stock of the serious nature of the security and humanitarian situation that continues to weigh on the people of North and South Kivu. These situations are worsened by the offensive launched by M23 with the support and participation of the Rwandan Defense Forces. Once again, in 3 decades of conflict, the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo is in the grips of violence perpetrated by armed groups, as well as chronic instability and the plundering of natural resources. This situation must call us to action. 1 month after the adoption of Resolution 2773, it is now incumbent upon this Council to remain involved in terms of promoting peace and security in the DRC and in the region as a whole. The Security Council spoke out in unambiguous terms to demand an immediate cessation of hostilities. Resolution 2773 called upon all parties to establish an effective, unconditional and immediate ceasefire. Through this text, the Security Council called unanimously for the immediate withdrawal of the RDF from the Congolese territory. The resolution also recalls the need to comply with international humanitarian law and to guarantee comprehensive, safe and unfettered humanitarian access, beginning with the reopening of the Goma airport. These appeals are just as vital today as they were before. Urgent progress must be seen with the implementation of Resolution 2773. Daily clashes are seen time and time again on the front lines. There are acts of violence committed against civilians, violations of human rights, and sexual violence continues to increase exponentially. There is a risk of conflagration in the region of the Great Lakes. The Council will not simply be able to limit itself to dealing with the current situation. Consequently, the upholding of the ceasefire is a major priority. France supports efforts to this end, whether we be talking about appeals for the ceasefire heard after the meeting in Doha on 18th of March or in the midst of the SADC-EAC regional process. The ceasefire must be implemented so that clashes cease and stop being a burden on the people in the East DRC. Dialogue initiatives must continue to achieve tangible and visible progress towards the end of the cessation of hostilities. Here, regional mediation processes have a key role to play in creating a solution to this conflict, which we need to see. France has supported the Luanda and Nairobi processes and will continue to support all regional efforts, making it possible to achieve a sustainable solution to the conflict, including the EAC SADC process. We support the coordination of these initiatives with UN action. The civil society and women must also be involved. I hail the engagement of Angola and their president, João Lourenço. He's worked tirelessly to promote dialogue and establish tangible parameters for a negotiated solution in order to see the complete withdrawal of Rwandan forces and the neutralization of the FDLR by the DRC. This must continue through SADC. We must build on these gains. I here hail the important role of MONUSCO. MONUSCO's role is evolving in an increasingly worsening environment. Its protection of civilians mandate must be protected. Across its theatre of operation, MONUSCO has the capacity to monitor the ceasefire once such an agreement has been reached. Pressure against MONUSCO must cease to this end. Attacks against blue helmets, which could be liable to constitute war crimes, cannot be accepted. The same thing can be said for restrictions placed on MONUSCO's freedom of movement or the discharging of its mandate. Madam President, the resolution of the Great Lakes conflict means that all parties must be involved in good faith, bolstered by the conviction that there is no military solution. A solution also required the continued involvement of this Council, closely connected with regional efforts. We support the Council's work in order to restore the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC and promote stability across the region as well as peace. We fully support MONUSCO and its head, Bintou Keita.
I thank the representative of France for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the members of the A3+, namely Algeria, Guyana, Somalia, and my country, Sierra Leone. We thank Ms. Bintou Keita, Special Representative of the Secretary General in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Head of the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the DRC, for our briefing and for presenting the Secretary General's quarterly report on the situation in the DRC. We also thank Ms. Charlotte Slente, Secretary General, Danish Refugee Council, for our contribution. We welcome the participation of His Excellency Olivier Ndugai, Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Rwanda, and the representatives of the DRC, Angola, and Burundi in today's meeting. Madam President, the A3+ extends sincere appreciation to the men, and women of MONUSCO for their dedicated service. They continue to demonstrate an unwavering commitment to protecting the lives of the Congolese people, despite the challenges and risks, particularly over this quarter. In the context of the ongoing hostilities, we're encouraged by recent improvements in security and humanitarian access that have allowed greater freedom of movement in the East. It is reassuring that evacuated MONUSCO personnel have been able to return to Goma, a positive sign of stabilization in that area. These developments give hope that MONUSCO will be able to carry out the critical mandate entrusted to it by this Council. We affirm our full support for MONUSCO's mandate and operations. As we look ahead, discussions about MONUSCO's activities, including plans for its future role, must be conducted in consultation with the DRC government and reflect the priorities of the Congolese people. National ownership and partnership are essential for the successful implementation of the mission's mandate. We also acknowledge the invaluable contributions of the regional mechanisms to security efforts in Eastern DRC. In this regard, the A3+ deeply appreciates the sacrifice and service of the Southern African Development Community Mission in the DRC, SAMI-DRC, which has now concluded its mandate. We thank the SADC member states that contributed troops and resources to this operation, and we commend their continued political engagement alongside the East African community in seeking a viable solution to the conflict in Eastern DRC. Madam President, the A3+ remains profoundly concerned about the dire humanitarian situation in Eastern DRC. The conflict continues to inflict a severe toll on the Congolese people. It has impacted every sector of society, exacerbating economic hardship, displacing millions, and upending entire communities. Children are out of school, women and girls are enduring increased conflict-related sexual violence, compounded by the lack of adequate support systems for survivors. The overall situation is nothing short of catastrophic. We again reiterate our urgent call for an immediate cessation of hostilities across Eastern DRC. There is no justification for the continuation of this devastating conflict. Every additional day of fighting deepens the suffering and despair of the population. We must act now to silence the guns and halt the bloodshed. The improved stability in the city of Goma is a window of calm that provides a crucial opportunity for humanitarian organizations to deliver life-saving assistance to those in need. We urge all aid agencies to seize this opportunity to reach vulnerable populations, and we call on all parties to ensure rapid, safe, and unhindered access for humanitarian operations. The A3+ welcomes recent steps towards de-escalation. In particular, we note the ceasefire announcement by the M23 AFC, including its commitment to withdraw from areas such as Walikale. We urge M23 AFC to fully honor these pledges and demonstrate restraint on the ground. All armed groups must end the violence immediately and uphold their ceasefire commitment. We call on this Council and the international community to support these efforts to ensure they lead to tangible peace. The A3+ stresses further that all parallel administrations set up in the territory of the DRC must be dismantled, and the AFC M23 must relinquish control over all territory seized. We strongly endorse the political process outlined in UN Security Council Resolution 2773, which incorporates the regional perspective on political dialogue. Resolution 2773, adopted unanimously, will affirm the DRC's sovereignty and territorial integrity, demanded an immediate and unconditional ceasefire by all armed groups, called for the withdrawal of any external support to these groups, and urged the resumption of dialogue under existing regional mechanisms. The A3+ calls for the swift and full implementation of this resolution by all concerned parties. Its message is clear, and the A3+ reiterates that message. There is no military solution to this conflict. Sustainable peace in the DRC will only be achieved through inclusive dialogue and African-led solutions. In this respect, we commend the concerted diplomatic efforts of African leaders and regional organizations to resolve the conflict. We pay tribute to His Excellency, President João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço of Angola, who has tirelessly mediated between the DRC and Rwanda in the spirit of African-led solutions to African challenges. We also recognize the important facilitating role of former President Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya in the EAC-led Nairobi process. These efforts have laid critical groundwork for peace. We welcome the recent decision by the regional leaders at the joint EAC-SADC summit on 24 March 2025 to harmonize the Luanda and Nairobi peace processes. This unified approach is critical and built upon the foundation laid by the facilitators of the Luanda and Nairobi processes. Our shared goal is to reach a lasting settlement that addresses the root causes of the conflict, meets the aspirations of the Congolese people, and considers the legitimate regional security concerns. We note that the African Union Peace and Security Council, at its February 2025 summit meeting, also underscored the need for a coordinated response to the crisis and endorsed these regional initiatives. The EAC and SADC have shown commendable unity by adopting a joint roadmap to peace and appointing a high-level panel of facilitators comprised of eminent former African heads of state to guide the peace process. The A3+ welcomes the establishment of this panel and urges all stakeholders to cooperate fully with the facilitators in the timely implementation of the roadmap. We also urge the full, equal, and meaningful involvement of women in the peace process. The Security Council must do its part to reinforce these African-led peace efforts. We urge the Council to remain engaged and to use all available tools to support the regional roadmap, including backing the joint peace process and the facilitator panel, and ensuring that the UN's effort, including those of MONUSCO, complement the regional strategy. Madam President, the A3+ gratefully acknowledges the support from international partners to the DRC in the form of humanitarian aid, development assistance, and diplomatic engagement. At the same time, we stress that all external effort must be closely coordinated with the Congolese authorities and aligned with the region's peace initiatives. We welcome the outcome of the trilateral meeting hosted by the State of Qatar in Doha on 18 March 2025, which brought together His Excellency President Felix Tshisekedi and His Excellency President Paul Kagame. In light of commitment made by both leaders in Doha to remain fully engaged in the joint Luanda and Nairobi process, the A3+ stresses that all processes for peace and security in DRC should align with this commitment with the African-led process. The presence of external forces risks exacerbating the situation and undermining ongoing effort. We therefore call on all actors to respect the DRC's sovereignty. In line with Resolution 2773, all uninvited foreign forces should withdraw from Congolese territory. Neighboring countries must ensure that they are not providing support or safe haven to any armed group. In closing, Madam President, the A3+ reiterates its unwavering commitment to the sovereignty, territorial integrity, peace, and stability of the DRC. We commend the parties for their continued engagement and willingness to pursue dialogue in search of a peaceful resolution. These are encouraging steps towards rebuilding trust and security in the country. The A3+ calls on the Security Council and the international community at large to provide steadfast and meaningful support to the DRC. This means not only bolstering MONUSCO's effort on the ground, but also fully backing the ongoing regional political initiatives that offer the best hope for durable peace. We must all remain actively seized of the matter and ready to assist as needed. The people of the Eastern DRC have suffered for too long. They are looking to us, in Africa and around the world, to help end their ordeal. We must not fail them. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank SRSG Ms. Bintou Keita for briefing us today, and Ms. Charlotte Slente, Secretary General of the Danish Refugee Council, for her remarks. Madam President, allow me to emphasize on the following points. First, the adoption of Resolution 2773 was urgently needed in order to address the deteriorating crisis in Eastern DRC. We believe that this resolution sent a clear, strong message to M23 to immediately cease hostilities and withdraw from Goma, Bukavu, and all other controlled areas. Greece resolutely opposes any violations of international law and the UN Charter and stresses its strong commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of the DRC. Second, we underline that there is no other solution to the conflict than a political solution based on dialogue, which remains essential. We welcome the recent meeting between President Tshisekedi and President Kagame in Doha, where they reaffirmed the commitment of all parties to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire as agreed at the joint EAC-SADC summit and endorsed by the African Union Peace and Security Council. Rwanda Defense Forces must now cease support to the M23 and immediately withdraw from DRC territory. We call for urgent de-escalation, and we stress that it is more imperative than ever that Rwanda and DRC re-engage immediately in the political dialogue and implement all decisions and commitments agreed under the Luanda and Nairobi processes. Third, the Resolution 2773 reiterates with the strongest voice the Council's full support to MONUSCO, which is acting within its mandate and is doing critical work in the DRC, in particular protecting the civilians, ensuring continued implementation of the MRM on children and armed conflict, and addressing urgent needs. The protection of civilians, as well as of humanitarian and medical personnel, must remain an absolute priority. We emphasize also our strong commitment to the safety and security of MONUSCO's personnel. Fourth, we are deeply concerned about the grave humanitarian and security consequences of the M23 offensive, both in North and South Kivu. All parties must respect international humanitarian law and ensure unrestricted humanitarian access. We strongly condemn all forms of human rights violations, abuses, violence against civilians, including against humanitarian and medical personnel, summary executions and maiming, sex and gender-based violence, human trafficking, recruitment and use of children. All continuing grave violations and abuses committed against children must halt, and all parties must uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Madam President, women and girls, being the main victims of the conflict, need to have unobstructed access to justice. We welcome the steps taken by the DRC government to hold perpetrators of grave violations against children accountable. Also, we urge the DRC to prioritize the prevention of sexual violence and all other grave violations. Finally, a meaningful political engagement of women and their solidarity and advocacy at regional, national, and international levels are key elements for the peace in Eastern DRC, as stressed by the Secretary General in his report. Madam President, we stand ready to support any further engagement of this Council as necessary. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me also thank SRSG Bintou Keita for her detailed briefing. We've also listened carefully to the compelling statement by Ms. Charlotte Slente of the Danish Refugee Council. Both briefings have underlined the imperative of dialogue and peace as the way forward. We also welcome participation of the representatives of DRC, the distinguished Foreign Minister of Rwanda, and the representatives of Angola and Burundi in this meeting. Madam President, in recent weeks, this Council has devoted considerable time and attention to the situation in the eastern DRC, where M23's military offensive with external support has imperiled peace and security, upended lives of innocent civilians, exacerbated the humanitarian situation, and drastically increased the risk of a wider escalation in the Great Lakes region. After due deliberation, the Council responded, adopting Resolution 2773 last month, reaffirming its strong commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of the DRC. Among other things, the Council strongly condemned the ongoing offensive and advances of the M23, decided that the M23 shall immediately cease hostilities, withdraw from Goma, Bukavu, and all controlled areas, and reiterated its urgent call for all parties to conclude an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. It also strongly urged the DRC and Rwanda to return without preconditions to diplomatic talks as a matter of urgency to achieve a lasting and peaceful resolution of the protracted conflict in the region. As we know, and as the Special Representative has also reported, the provisions of this resolution largely are yet to be implemented. This is a cause of great concern. We believe the Council's resolution must be respected and fully implemented by all parties. Secondly, it is evident that there is no military solution to this conflict, and this Council is not alone in promoting a peaceful resolution. There is close cooperation and synergy with the African Union and sub-regional efforts. In this regard, we commend the tireless efforts and leadership of President João Lourenço and former President Uhuru Kenyatta in advancing the Luanda and Nairobi processes, and express our support for the newly appointed facilitators of the two processes, which are now merged. All sides, particularly M23, must engage in good faith with the facilitators. We believe these African-led and facilitated processes provide the appropriate framework for comprehensively addressing the complex historic and ongoing underlying factors, including the legitimate security concerns of all sides. We also acknowledge the role of Qatar in facilitating leadership-level dialogue between Rwanda and the DRC that reaffirmed the commitment of all parties to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, as agreed at the joint EAC-SADC summit of 8 February. Lastly, we commend MONUSCO peacekeepers for their efforts under extremely difficult conditions. While they are able to operate in 60% of the territory under MONUSCO's mandate, M23 controls the remaining 40%, thus restricting the mission's movements. These restrictions must be lifted fully, and those obstructing MONUSCO or endangering peacekeepers must be held accountable. MONUSCO continues to have a critical role in Eastern DRC. It is not the time for disengagement, but enhanced engagement. We have taken note of the EAC-SADC Summit's recommendation that the mission's capacities be reinforced to enable it to play a role in ceasefire monitoring and securitization efforts in the region. The mission would need to be adequately strengthened and equipped to discharge its current or modified mandate in future in consultation with the government of the DRC. Given the intensive engagement of this Council, together with African Union and other sub-regional mechanisms, we are of the view that it will be in the interest of the DRC and Rwanda, and in fact the wider region, to really benefit from this environment by demonstrating political will and genuine commitment and cooperation, particularly through implementation of this Council's resolutions and the decisions of the African Union Peace and Security Council and sub-regional organizations to lay the foundation of durable peace and stability in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. I thank SRSG Keita for her briefing. I've also listened attentively to the statement by Ms. Slent. I welcome the presence of His Excellency Nduhungi Reihai, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Rwanda, and the permanent representatives of DRC, Angola, and Burundi. Over the past 2 months, the situation in the eastern DRC has been turbulent, with the Great Lakes region being pushed to the brink of regional conflict. Since the Council's unanimous adoption of Resolution 2773, the situation has eased a little bit, but the M23 still occupies areas such as Goma and Bukavu, making the situation on the ground complex and volatile, and a future filled with uncertainty. The current round of conflict and violence has resulted in the loss of more than 7,000 lives and the forced displacement of hundreds of thousands of people, making the humanitarian situation extremely grave. Any additional day of conflict brings more suffering to the people and more destruction to the region. An immediate and unconditional ceasefire is a clear demand of Resolution 2773 of the Council, an overriding priority at this moment, and the basic consensus and universal core of the international community. China urges M23 to honor its commitment to a ceasefire, withdraw from the occupied territories, and lift restrictions on humanitarian access. All parties to the conflict should effectively fulfill their obligations under international humanitarian law by taking measures to protect civilians and making every effort to ease the humanitarian crisis. History shows that there is no military solution to the question of the Eastern DRC, and that dialogue and negotiation are the only way out. We welcome the direct talks recently held in Qatar between the leaders of the DRC and Rwanda, and hope the two sides will stay engaged to address each other's security concerns through dialogue and negotiations. China welcomes the decision of the DRC government to engage in direct dialogue with M23. M23, in return, should respond to the good office's efforts responsibly and return to the track of dialogue as soon as possible. China always supports African countries in solving African problems in African ways. Council Resolution 2773 is based on support for regional processes. At the beginning of this week, the EAC and the SADC held their second joint summit, during which they called for the implementation of the roadmap adopted at the joint ministerial meeting and the appointment of a panel of facilitators to promote good offices. China welcomes these efforts. We encourage all parties to the conflict to expedite the implementation of the ceasefire plan and support the good offices of the panel of facilitators. The Security Council and the international community should actively support regional efforts and create a favorable environment for the regional process. President, MONUSCO, based on Council's mandate, has made enormous efforts and sacrifices to protect civilians under extremely difficult and dangerous circumstances. Its implementation of peacekeeping mandate should not be impeded. The safety of peacekeepers should not be compromised, and any attack on or targeting of MONUSCO is unacceptable. All parties to the conflict should facilitate its performance of its duties and lift unreasonable restrictions on its freedom of movement, logistical supplies, and troop rotation. China supports a bigger role by MONUSCO in the peace process in the Eastern DRC in light of the changing landscape and is ready to participate actively in the Council's discussions. At present,
The question of the DRC is at a critical juncture for political settlement. China firmly supports the DRC in safeguarding its sovereignty and territorial integrity and stands ready to work with all parties to play a constructive role in ending the conflict at an early date and restoring peace and tranquility. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement, and I give now the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias, señora.
Thank you, Madam President. Distinguished members of the Council, allow me to begin by thanking Ms. Bintou Keita, Special Representative of the Secretary-General in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I thank her for her presentation of the Secretary-General's report issued in accordance with Resolution 2765 of this Council. Moreover, we express our gratitude for the participation of Charlotte Slente, Secretary-General of the Danish Refugee Council. We also recognize the representatives of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Rwanda, Angola, and Burundi. They do us a great honor by being here at this meeting today. Panama notes with grave concern the continued worsening of the situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There, the people continue to fall victim to systematic violations of human rights, as well as to increased recruitment of children to armed conflicts and an alarming escalation of sexual and gender-based violence, this disproportionately affecting women and girls. Since the taking of the city of Goma in January 2025, reports of systematic human rights violations and abuses have increased greatly in number. Recent reports document indiscriminate attacks against hospitals, attacks in which M23 combatants have abducted patients, including civilians and wounded Congolese soldiers. They have been subjected to inhumane treatment and torture. Moreover, we have received reports of atrocity crimes, such as gang rapes and attacks against human rights defenders in North Kivu and South Kivu. Sexual and gender-based violence have reached unacceptable levels. Humanitarian organizations have reported a significant increase in sexual assaults in these regions, with more than 38,000 cases documented in the province of North Kivu alone in the first quarter of this year. Moreover, girls and boys are among the primary victims of this conflict. According to UNICEF, thousands of minors have been subjected to sexual violence, abductions, and forced recruitment by armed groups. In addition, we have seen the closure of more than 2,500 schools. This has left around 795,000 girls and boys with no access to education, and this has devastating consequences for the region's development and its long-term stability. The humanitarian crisis also continues to grow to critical levels. Around 8 million people have been internally displaced as a result of persistent violence and insecurity. At the same time, 22 million people now require urgent humanitarian assistance. These communities are facing extreme levels of food insecurity, limited access to drinking water, and to essential healthcare services. This fragile situation in terms of healthcare has expedited the spread of illnesses such as cholera, measles and malaria, and that's having particularly regrettable consequences for children who are extremely vulnerable. The international community cannot remain indifferent in the face of this tragedy. It is vital that we step up humanitarian efforts, increase victim support, and demand the accountability of those responsible for perpetrating these atrocities. Elsewhere, we express our heartfelt thanks for the tireless work of MONUSCO personnel, particularly that of the Blue Helmets, whose commitment, devotion and courage deserve the highest degree of recognition. We here resolutely recall that the protection of peacekeeping personnel is non-negotiable. With that in mind, we are gravely concerned by the fact that in spite of diplomatic efforts seen, we continue to see restrictions placed on MONUSCO's movement by M23. That situation not only jeopardizes the security and well-being of those deployed in the field, but it also weakens the operational efficiency of MONUSCO. We take note of the gradual withdrawal of MONUSCO, which was planned before the recent escalation of the conflict, and now, however, it's suffering serious setbacks owing to the fact the situation is worsening. Moreover, we decry the significant losses suffered by peacekeeping forces. We've seen the death of 3 blue helmets and 37 wounded in the clashes. That underscores the growing risks facing the mission on the ground. In the face of this grave crisis, we endorse and echo the Secretary-General's appeal, an appeal demanding an immediate ceasefire to avoid greater bloodshed. Missions such as MONUSCO embody the collective promise made by the international community not to abandon peoples in regions where peace is under threat. This promise, in order to be a genuine one, must be underpinned by tangible actions and sustained commitment. We recognize and value regional efforts made to calm the conflict, and we express our concern at the recent announcement made by Angola that it will withdraw from its role as mediator. That stands as an additional challenge to diplomatic efforts underway to achieve peace in the region. Madam President, Panama appreciates diplomatic initiatives undertaken by Qatar and other international actors. However, we underscore the importance of ensuring that the region continue to strengthen its own dialogue mechanisms with the goal of achieving a sustainable and lasting solution to the conflict. We reiterate the fact that the solution to the situation in the DRC cannot be solely a military one. It is urgent that we embark upon a comprehensive political journey, one which includes the dialogue between the government and all stakeholders. It must also include the strengthening of the rule of law, respect for human rights, and a regional approach which effectively involves neighbouring countries in bringing about de-escalation. Finally, Panama reaffirms its commitment to active diplomacy which fosters a lasting peace and the protection of the very tenets of the United Nations Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, SRSG Bintu Keita and Ms. Charlotte Slente, for your briefings today. It is essential that this Council and the international community continue to receive objective, credible reporting on the dire situation affecting Congolese civilians and UN personnel in eastern DRC. The United States denounces the increasingly antagonistic rhetoric coming from Rwandan government officials and the Rwanda-backed M23, including threats against senior MONUSCO leadership and false claims that MONUSCO supports the FDLR. These statements are unacceptable and irresponsible, especially from Rwanda, a major contributor to UN peacekeeping, including through senior leadership positions. The United States strongly condemns the continued advances by M23 and Rwanda Defense Forces throughout North and South Kivu. We welcome all parties' engagement in the joint EAC SADC process, especially the commitment to reach an unconditional and permanent ceasefire. However, signing communiques is only a first step. Following through is much more difficult. We will be watching the actions of the parties closely and remain prepared to take further measures as needed. As the largest financial contributor for MONUSCO, the United States is deeply invested in its effectiveness. The mission must be allowed to move freely and implement its mandate in M23-controlled areas. We demand M23 immediately cease its obstruction of MONUSCO and take the necessary steps to reopen the Goma airport without further delay. We recognize the role MONUSCO could play in supporting an end to this crisis. Through its expertise, mandate, and infrastructure, MONUSCO is well equipped to support the implementation of a ceasefire or negotiated solution, as it has done many times throughout its history. However, absent a sustainable ceasefire or guarantees for MONUSCO's freedom of movement, UN troops are prevented from leaving their bases, all while M23 commits human rights abuses across Goma. This situation is unsustainable. If MONUSCO can no longer carry out its mandate to protect civilians in M23-controlled areas, we as Council members should consider all options, including a re-examination of the mission's mandate, which no longer reflects its operating environment. Outside of M23-controlled areas, MONUSCO is making tangible, life-saving contributions to the DRC's security, including through rapid deployments that protect civilians from armed groups. We urge DRC forces and Uganda to deconflict operations with MONUSCO and support its efforts to protect civilians, disrupt armed group attacks, and counter any terrorist threats. We acknowledge the decision by SADC to terminate the mandate of SAMI DRC and honor the troops that gave their lives in service of Congolese stability. M23 and Rwandan forces must facilitate a safe and orderly withdrawal of SAMI DRC forces and equipment. As regional peace processes continue, we stress the need to avoid duplication of efforts and leverage the comparative advantages of viable existing forums and mechanisms, including those MONUSCO is already mandated to support. Furthermore, if regional actors envision a role for MONUSCO to support such processes, they should ensure MONUSCO has a seat at the table. Finally, 2 months after M23 and Rwandan forces seized Goma, and more recently Bukavu and Walikale, we underscore the need for sustained pressure on all parties to work in good faith toward a diplomatic resolution to the conflict in eastern DRC. We must abandon the fantasy of short-term military solutions in favor of a durable peace powered by regional and international investment that allows the Great Lakes region to benefit from its vast natural wealth. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we'd like to thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Ms. Bintu Keita, for her briefing. We welcome the participation in this meeting of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Rwanda, Mr. Olivier Nduhungirehe, as well as the representatives of the DRC, Angola and Burundi. We listened very carefully to the Secretary General of the Danish Refugee Council, Ms. Charlotte Slente. Over a month has passed since the Security Council adopted Resolution 2773. Regrettably, today we're compelled to acknowledge that the main demands of the Council have not been implemented. Hostilities are ongoing, and a ceasefire has not been established. The M23 is expanding its territorial control and imposing its administrative and management system in the areas it has taken over. The call for Rwanda and the DRC to stop its cooperation with illegal armed groups, has been ignored. We call for the swift implementation of Resolution 2773, an end to military clashes, and a withdrawal of M23 from settlements they've seized and territories they've occupied. We call on Rwanda to respond to Security Council's demands to stop support to the M23 and withdraw their military units. This is necessary, first and foremost, for the Congolese people, civilians. Owing to the hostilities since the start of the year, thousands of Congolese have died, hundreds of thousands have been internally displaced, the majority of them repeatedly so. In conflict-affected regions, there are ubiquitous human rights violations, including sexual violence and the recruitment of children into the ranks of illegal armed groups. We shouldn't forget that behind these statistics, there are actual people. They're paying with their lives and the well-being of their families for the inability of politicians to settle their differences at the negotiating table. We're disquieted by the growing trend of the conflict's regionalization and the sharpening of disagreements between states in the Great Lakes region. Clearly, under these circumstances, what we need is to intensify regional diplomatic efforts. First and foremost, they should be focused on the implementation of consensus-based decisions taken at the AU Summit and the EAC SADC Summit. This is the only path towards sustainable political formulae for settling the crisis. There cannot be a military solution. We welcome the important agreements reached following the EAC SADC Summit on the 24th of March. We are expecting for the roadmap of practical steps on settling the crisis to be effectively implemented, as well as for the effective work of the high-level facilitator panel made up of well-respected political leaders from the region. We support our African colleagues' focus on harmonizing the Luanda and Nairobi processes. We've also taken note of the fact that the presidents of the DRC and Rwanda met in Doha with Qatar's mediation. We hope that this meeting will be a step on the way towards the normalization of relations between the two states. On a separate note, we'd like to underscore that without resolving the status of the M23, a viable political formula for ending the conflict cannot be found. Since the very start of the escalation, we've followed with alarm developments surrounding MONUSCO. Attacks on peacekeepers are unacceptable under any circumstances. Peacekeepers' safety is a priority for all of us. The escalation of the crisis has had a most serious impact on the mission's ability to effectively implement its mandate. We stand convinced that the Council must swiftly respond to the situation as it unfolds. We shouldn't put up with the status quo that's been imposed, especially in areas that are under 23 control now. The situation of peacekeepers in Goma and surrounding areas is unstable. It cannot remain this way going forward. The reputational risks to UN peacekeeping are simply too high. What's highly dubious in our view is the hospitality extended by MONUSCO to members of European private military companies. We want to reiterate that MONUSCO's mandate as regards disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of former combatants bestowed upon it by the Security Council bears no relation to the events we witnessed thanks to the media's reporting. Given the potential further transition of MONUSCO, the Council must first and foremost consider the situation on the ground. We must act in a timely fashion without allowing for the situation to deteriorate due to any changes in the configuration of the peacekeeping presence in the country. It's important for us to hear the opinion of Secretariat colleagues on this front. We will ascribe serious significance, without a doubt, to the position of the host country, and we hope that we will be apprised of it in the very near future. To conclude, we'd like to once again express our solidarity with the government and people of the DRC. The Russian Federation insists on the need to respect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, independence, and unity of the DRC as per the UN Charter. We will continue working to achieve this in practice, as well as for the crisis to be settled diplomatically. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. Let me start by thanking SOSG Keita and Ms. Slente for briefing us today. And I pay tribute to the work of the brave staff and personnel of MONUSCO operating in the most challenging environment. I welcome the participation of the representatives of the DRC, Rwanda, Angola and Burundi. President, I will make 4 points. First, the UK regrets that despite the clear and urgent message that this Council sent last month, with the unanimous adoption of Resolution 2773, M23 and Rwandan Defence Forces have continued their territorial advance. We strongly condemn the capture of Walikale, and we reiterate that the Rwandan Defence Forces must withdraw from sovereign Congolese territory, and all regional actors must cease support for armed groups. In addition, the UK condemns M23's continued restrictions on MONUSCO, which have prevented the mission being able to deliver key tasks mandated by this Council. Second, the UK welcomes efforts to deliver a peaceful resolution to the conflict. This includes the joint work of EAC and SADC and its creation of a panel of facilitators. The UK also recognises the efforts of His Highness the Emir of Qatar to convene President Tshisekedi and President Kagame for discussions in support of regional processes. We regret that despite the commitments made, an immediate and unconditional ceasefire has not yet materialised. In addition, the UK is grateful to Angola and President Lourenço for his exemplary leadership in securing significant agreements for sustainable peace. The Luanda process made important steps forward, including agreement on a harmonised plan for neutralising the FDLR, disengaging the Rwandan Defence Forces from DRC, and, most recently, agreement by the DRC government to direct talks with M23. We deeply regret that M23 were not willing to participate in these talks. Third, as we've heard from our briefers, the humanitarian situation in DRC remains dire. The UK supports the joint calls by EAC and SADC for the reopening of Goma Airport and humanitarian supply routes. We call on all parties to protect civilians, including from sexual and gender-based violence, and immediately end and prevent the abduction and recruitment of the use of children. The UK has committed over $18 million of humanitarian support to those in need in eastern DRC. Finally, President, the conflict in eastern DRC is undermining security across the region. We urge the parties to engage now in the regionally led peace processes to bring it to a sustainable end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank SRSG Keita and Ms. Salente for their briefing today. I also welcome the Minister Nduhurigire of Rwanda and representatives of DRC, Angola, Burundi to this meeting. Ever since the M23's offensive began last January, the Council has convened for the fifth time today and adopted a strong, unanimous resolution 2773. African states, regional organizations, and friendly countries have also made relentless diplomatic efforts to facilitate a political solution. Despite all these collective endeavors, it is deplorable that an immediate ceasefire is yet to be agreed upon and conflict violence continue to escalate in eastern DRC. Over the past week, we have witnessed the fighting over control of Walikale, another strategic and resource-rich town west of Goma. Moreover, while attention remains focused on the Putin North region in North Kivu, violent attacks against civilians by the ADF, Codeco have increased in Grand Nord and Ituri. Every day, without cessation of hostilities, exacerbates the humanitarian crisis, displacing hundreds of thousands and leading to grave human rights regressions. Let me emphasize 3 points in response to this precarious situation. First, the Republic of Korea strongly urges DRC and Rwanda to swiftly agree on political solution, as there is no military solution to the conflict. For this truly materialized, M23 must immediately cease hostilities and withdraw from all occupying areas. Both Rwanda and DRC must refrain from escalating the conflict by supporting armed groups. DRC's sovereignty and territorial integrity should be respected. We commend and support recent regional efforts led by the EAC and SADC and look forward to the role of the 5-member panel of facilitators who will build on the significant contributions of President Lourenço of Angola to this peace process. We also welcome the momentous trilateral meeting hosted by Qatar, which reaffirmed the commitment to regional initiatives. Second, we express concern on opportunistic attacks against the civilians by the ADF and Codeco in Grand Nord and Ituri, which is significantly increased in February. We urge armed groups to return to dialogue on the PDDRCS. In this context, MONUSCO's mandate remains critical in protecting civilians from potential attacks, particularly in Jugu. We encourage strengthened coordination between relevant authorities in this regard. MONUSCO's freedom of movement must be ensured. Attempts to hinder its mandate must cease, and the safety and security of peacekeepers must be prioritized as they operate under extremely difficult situations. Third, all parties must uphold their obligation under international humanitarian law and human rights law to end the terrible sufferings of civilians. We are deeply concerned by the alarming scale of human rights abuses and violations. Reports of sexual violence affecting over 60 victims daily, along with the lootings, killings, and the forced return of internally displaced persons, are appalling. We hope that Human Rights Council's decision to establish a fact-finding mission and independent commission of the inquiry would ensure accountability for all those who are responsible. Unhindered humanitarian access and the safety of the humanitarian personnel are essential for delivering life-saving aid. We reiterate the Council's call in Resolution 2773 to urgently open humanitarian corridors as well as Goma, Kabumu airports in this regard. Madam President, Republic of Korea reaffirms the steadfast support for MONUSCO, SRSG, Keita, and regional and sub-regional organizations for their efforts in addressing this grave situation. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to thank SRSG Keita for her briefing and Ms. Sente for her contribution to today's meeting. Madam President, Slovenia remains deeply concerned about the ongoing situation in eastern DRC. We are particularly concerned for all victims who bear the heaviest burden for all civilians who bear the heaviest burden of this conflict. As we have heard again today, current M23 offensive, supported by the Rwandan Defense Forces, continues to destabilize eastern DRC and the broader Great Lake region. The region is being pushed to the brink of war. I wish to make 3 points in this respect. First, we are deeply troubled by the ongoing reports of persistent and serious violations of international humanitarian law and human rights violations and abuses, particularly reports of widespread sexual and gender-based violence. We strongly condemn any violence targeting civilians. We denounce the actions of armed groups including M23, ADF, Codeco, Zaire, FDLR, those operating under the Vazalendo or VDP labels, as well as reported violations of FARDC members. Such violations are abhorrent, and all perpetrators must be held to account. We are concerned that the full extent of it may not be clear yet, due to significant challenges in monitoring and verification. We welcome and emphasize the importance of the work of the fact-finding mission and the Independent Commission of Inquiry in this respect. Second, it is deeply regrettable that calls, regional and international, including from this Council, for immediate cessation of hostilities, protection of civilians, and withdrawal from occupied territories have not been fully heard and respected. We wish to recall that resolutions of this Council, including 2773, which calls for immediate cessation of hostilities and withdrawal from occupied territories, are legally binding and must be implemented. We call on M23 to end its advances and withdraw immediately, as the rapid offense is pushing the entire region into insecurity. We also continue to call, in line with its CONOPS commitment, on Rwanda to withdraw its military presence from the DRC's territory and to cease its support for M23, and on the DRC to end its cooperation with the FDLR and any other armed group. Third, M23 restrictions on MONUSCO and humanitarian actors in Goma and occupied areas in North Kivu are unacceptable, as they impede mandated and critical operations amid a growing protection crisis. MONUSCO's ability to implement its mandate must be fully respected. Operational freedom for MONUSCO must be ensured. M23 must immediately lift all restrictions impacting peacekeepers as well as humanitarian medical personnel. Attacks on them and threats against their safety and the safety of their facilities are inexcusable. We remind all parties of their obligations under international humanitarian law. Humanitarian workers must not be targeted and should be protected. Unconditional, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access must be granted. Airports in Goma and Kavumu must be reopened and made accessible so that humanitarian assistance and the rotation of the UN peacekeepers and other personnel can proceed. Madam President, in conclusion, as in all other situations before this Council, Slovenia will actively support all meaningful efforts toward durable peace. We welcome the recent meeting between President Tshisekedi and Kagame in Doha and encourage building on their expressed commitment to a ceasefire. The crisis has no military solution, and returning to negotiations in good faith without delay is the right step towards a peace agreement. Slovenia also strongly supports regional efforts through the African Union, EAC and SADC, as well as other bilateral engagement to ensure swift de-escalation and to pave the way for durable peace. We welcome the second joint communiqué of the EAC-SADC summit and urge swift implementation of its conclusions. We take this opportunity to extend our appreciation to President Lourenço of Angola for his valuable contributions and stewardship. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of Denmark. And I'll start also, like others, to thank SRSG Keita and Secretary General Slente for their insightful but also concerning briefings. More than 5 weeks have passed since this Council unanimously adopted Resolution 2773, calling for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire in the DRC under Chapter 7 of this Charter. Yet today, civilians in the DRC continue to live in fear of killings, sexual and gender-based violence, and displacement. Allow me to make 4 key points. First, a political solution must be found and supported by all stakeholders. Such a solution is the only viable path to end the widespread human suffering in the DRC. This Council must continue to put its full weight and support behind the African leadership in the region to resolve this crisis. We must also insist on the implementation of our own resolutions, especially 2773. We know President Lourenço's decision to step down as mediator in the conflict in eastern DRC, and we commend him for his unrelenting efforts. We welcome the messages from the meeting on 18 March between President Tshisekedi and President Kagame held in Doha. At the same time, we encourage close coordination of all mediation efforts with the ongoing regional processes and underline the importance of the participation of women. Second, all parties must respect international humanitarian law. Civilians must never be a target and must be protected, including from sexual and gender-based violence. This is the responsibility of all parties. We condemn instances of looting, attacks on aid workers, and block supply routes, as also described in the statement of the Secretary General of Danish Refugee Council. Such obstructions place civilians at even greater risk of violence, malnutrition, and disease. As the SRSG has stressed, we urge the immediate reopening of the Goma and Kavumu airports, as well as the safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access to all those in need. Civilians must be able to return safely to their homes and granted safety in IDP camps in M23 control areas. We commend local actors, especially women-led organizations, who continue to provide essential services and support at grave risk to their own safety. Third, we deplore the continued threats and reprisals against human rights defenders, journalists, civil society, and judicial authorities. An environment of vigilante justice and breakdown of law and order has continued to spread in the East, with reports of widespread instances of extrajudicial killings, hate speech, and other human rights violations and abuses. This must end now. All parties must immediately uphold their obligations under international human rights law, protect civic space, and commit to prevent and combat the spread of mis- and disinformation. We reiterate our call for accountability for all those responsible for grave violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. We support the work of the DRC authorities to provide justice to the victims and note the recent visits of the ICC prosecutor to the DRC to meet with the authorities and local stakeholders. Persistent impunity is a driver of new atrocity crimes. We must do all we can to break this cycle. Fourth, let me reiterate Denmark's full support for MONUSCO as the mission continues to deliver on its mandate in an extremely complex situation. We demand the immediate restoration of the mission's freedom of movement and its full ability to resupply and rotate staff in the M23 controlled areas. Colleagues, as each day passes, the political crisis and its security and humanitarian consequences deepen. We call on Rwanda to end its support to M23 and withdraw its troops from the DRC. Moreover, the DRC needs to sever its ties with the FDLR and any other armed group. The Congolese people deserve peace. Every step taken must be to this end. And now resume my function as President of the Council, and I give the floor to the representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, distinguished members of the Council, I wish at the outset to warmly congratulate you on behalf of the delegation of the DRC. I'm congratulating you on your presidency of the Security Council for March as the month draws to a close. Thanks to your wisdom, your skill, and your qualities, your sterling qualities as a diplomat, you have successfully steered the work of this council. I also wish to thank your predecessor, Ambassador Fukong. He steered the council's work also equally successfully last month. The Democratic Republic of the Congo welcomes the detailed briefing delivered by the Special Representative of the Secretary General in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ms. Bintou Keita. We also welcome to our meeting the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Rwanda, His Excellency Mr. Olivier Nduhungirehe, and we welcome Madame Charlotte Slente of the Danish Refugee Council. She objectively detailed the hell and the bitter ordeal besetting the Congolese people in areas under control of the Rwandan army and the M23 AFC proxies. Today's statement will focus on the following 4 points: the report of the Secretary General on the situation in Eastern DRC, the implementation of Resolution 2773 of the Security Council, peace initiatives already underway, and the adoption of sanctions as measures with which to implement Resolution 2773 of the Security Council. Madam President, thousands of people have been killed. Thousands of people have been internally displaced. Entire cities have been devastated. Walikale, Kamanyola, Bunagana, Masisi-Centre, Goma, Minova, Ijwi, and Bukavu. In a humanitarian context which is chaotic on all fronts, the east of the DRC yet again offers a particularly distressing spectacle. The Secretary General's report, issued as Document S/2025/176, has been circulated to your Council, and it says the very same. Rwandan Defense Forces and the AFC M23 proxies have crossed our borders. They have occupied strategic locations, turfed people from their homes, and established a parallel administration. they continue to flagrantly violate, in so doing, the DRC's sovereignty. In its communiqué issued on the 15th of March 2025, the Ministry of the Interior, Security, Decentralization and Customary Affairs of the Democratic Republic of the Congo documented a series of atrocities perpetrated by the Rwandan Defense Forces and their M23 AFC proxies in North Kivu and South Kivu, this in violation of the relevant provisions of Resolution 2773, adopted on the 21st of February 2025. These acts have caused the huge loss of human life and mass destruction. The communiqué quite rightly documented that between the 10th and 14th of March 2025, there were 62 cases of targeted killings and summary executions in the areas under occupation. Moreover, there were 17 cases of violations and numerous cases of pillaging on the part of the Rwandan forces and their allies. Among the most striking incidents, the Rwandan army and the M23 AFC coalition staged a second incursion, I did say a second incursion, into the CBCA Ndusho hospital on the 10th of March. During that event, they abducted around 100 patients and healthcare workers who were later summarily executed. The communiqué aforementioned also reports the death of Mr. Fikri Mushuko Antoine, the head of the Mfui Matanda group. He was abducted from the CBCA Ondosho hospital on the 3rd of March and tortured for 7 days by Rwandan soldiers. Madam President, this alarming situation underscores the urgent need to implement to the letter the provisions of Resolution 2773 of the Security Council. This in order to put an end to the violence and protect the civilians in the regions affected. This bleak, unfortunate picture is being painted more than a month after the Security Council, through its Resolution 2773, unanimously called upon the Rwandan Defense Forces to withdraw immediately from the territory of the Democratic Republic of the Congo unconditionally. The resolution also demanded that they cease to support the M23. It too must withdraw from Goma, Bukavu and all areas under their control and entirely dismantle the illegitimate parallel administrations that have been established on the territory of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The unanimous adoption, says the Speaker, on the 21st of February 2025 of Resolution 2773 was a significant step forward in efforts to resolve the crisis and restore a lasting peace in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This peace involves restoring the Congolese state's authority across all occupied provinces in North Kivu and South Kivu in their entirety. The resolution stands as a response to the security and humanitarian crises and challenges which are dealing a heavy blow to the people in the east of our country that for 30 years now have been in the grips of violence. The text is also an expression of clear and explicit support from the international community to the efforts taken by the AU, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, SADC and the East African Community. Far from hindering African initiatives, Resolution 2773 strengthens and supplements them. The extent and persistent nature of the aforementioned violence suggests that we can no longer allow this crisis to drag on for eternity, claiming that an African problem requires an African solution. Doing that would be to betray the spirit of international solidarity, which is the very bedrock of the United Nations collective security system. Now is the time to recall that the Democratic Republic of the Congo legitimately expects this Council to resolutely and diligently finish the work it started here on the 21st of February 2025, work to protect international peace and security in accordance with the tenets of the United Nations Charter. In other words, the Council must now implement Resolution 2773. That is and must be a priority. To date, no Rwandan soldier has withdrawn from the DRC's territory. No element of the M23 AFC coalition has withdrawn from Goma or Bukavu, nor from any other area under control, and no parallel administration, illegitimate parallel administration indeed, has been dismantled. On the contrary, every day we're seeing the positions held by the RDF M23 AFC coalitions growing stronger. They tirelessly continue their expansionist and criminal agenda. They are hungry to defy the Security Council's will in so doing, and through their actions they are killing peace-building efforts undertaken by regional leaders, including those of the AU, SADC and the ERC, as well as others by the international community as a whole. After having established a parallel administration in Goma in North Kivu and in Bukavu in South Kivu, the RDF AFC M23 coalition extended its territorial conquest to the Walikale territory in North Kivu and to Mwenga in South Kivu. And this happened at a time when appeals were growing in number for a ceasefire. This means that the aforementioned coalition is brazenly impertinent in violating its own ceasefire. Worse still, this coalition is now maliciously transplanting non-indigenous populations under the guise of refugee return, and that has paved the way for interethnic tensions, which we're very likely to see in the future. The coalition has also readied itself to sell off DRC's monetary sovereignty by looking to appoint a parallel banking regulation system and a parallel central bank. This is true if we are to believe statements made to the press by the coalition's leader on the 22nd of March. Madam President, the DRC wishes to thank and congratulate His Excellency João Manuel Rosso, President of the Republic of Angola. He demonstrated resolute commitment in his role as AU-appointed mediator for the conflict which is pitting the DRC against Rwanda. Contrary to the recalcitrance of Rwanda, the DRC is highly committed, as is its head of state, His Excellency Félix Antoine Tshisekedi Chilombo. We are committed to the peace initiatives of the AU and sub-regional economic commissions. That commitment is unswerving. Our support extends to the joint SADC-EAC summit that adopted the report on the conclusions of the ministerial summit held on the 17th of March in Zimbabwe. That summit also ordered the implementation of the roadmap. The Luanda process, designed to offer a framework within which to achieve a peaceful resolution to the conflict, was sabotaged by Rwanda's stubbornness. Every commitment that they entered into in Luanda has been ridden roughshod over time and time again. Her Excellency Madame Therese Kwalikamba Wagner, Minister of State, Minister of Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation and Francophonie of the DRC, reiterated time and time again before this council a few weeks ago the fact that since the establishment of the enhanced ad hoc verification mechanism in Goma in November 2025, Rwanda has not once sent its 3 military experts to oversee the implementation of the ceasefire. On the 15th of December 2024, Rwanda knowingly sabotaged the summit convened by the facilitator of this process, His Excellency João Lourenço, by ignoring his invitation to the meeting. Moreover, on the 23rd of January, Rwanda surprised the entire world by requesting that Turkey act as mediator. In so doing, they strayed from the principal African solutions to African problems. As we might have expected, Rwanda and its proxies, who said that they swore only by direct negotiations between the RDC and AFC M23, were the first to boycott the Luanda meeting on the 18th of March. Despite this flagrant disregard shown by Rwanda for peace processes underway, the Democratic Republic of the Congo remains fully committed and reiterates its trust in any and all peace processes supported by the African Union to bring about a political solution to the conflict between the DRC and Rwanda. Two subregions, SADC and the EAC, have held joint meetings to adopt urgent measures, including a ceasefire. As far as the African Union is concerned, its Peace and Security Council met at heads of state level on the 14th of February. It called for the immediate withdrawal of all uninvited foreign forces from DRC, in other words, Rwanda. Rwanda and the M23 responded and continue to respond with violence, with terror. Indiscriminate, systematic violence continues to be seen. The victims of that violence hail from all ethnic groups and are of all political colours. We are seeing the rapid deterioration of the situation on the ground. And many stakeholders have reacted by doing what they do best. They've documented human rights violations, paving the way for criminal prosecutions. This is robust action, but is reactive rather than preemptive. Madam President, on a different note, we cannot lose sight of the fact that the speedy, gradual, ordered and responsible withdrawal of MINUSCO continues to be in sync with the logic underpinning the disengagement note co-signed on the 21st of November 2023 by the government of the DRC and MONUSCO. It was endorsed by the Security Council pursuant to Resolution 2717 of the 19th of December. There was momentum for disengagement, which began in South Kivu on the 25th of June 2024. It was brutally deflated following attacks on FARDC and MONUSCO positions by the RDF AFC M23 coalition. However, parties remain committed to the comprehensive implementation of the joint disengagement plan on the humanitarian track now. Paragraphs 49 to 53 of the Secretary General's report confirm that the situation is a devastating one, a situation incidentally worsened greatly by RDF M23 AFC attacks. Against this backdrop, one of our major challenges remains mobilizing remaining funds to meet colossal need. We take this opportunity to reiterate our appeal to donors. We ask them to step up their efforts to plug the funding gap. More or less 93% of the funding needed is still lacking. The Humanitarian Response Plan for 2025 was launched jointly on the 27th of February by the government and its partners. It seeks to assist more or less 11 million people of the 21.2 million that currently are in need. The estimated budget stands at $2.54 billion, but has only been financed to date to the tune of 7%. Madam President, as regards the human rights track, my government wishes to draw the Council's attention to the continued worsening of the human rights situation in areas under the control of the RDF M23 AFC coalition. In particular, certain worrying incidents have been corroborated in the Secretary General's report. I request you to peruse paragraphs 35 to 40. Several other human rights and IHL violations were reported as having been perpetrated by the RDF M23 AFC coalition. Here I'd recall in this connection the killing of at least 126 people in areas controlled by M23 since the 26th of January, abductions of civilians, forced recruitment of young people, including children, and the fact that they've been subjected to forced labour in Goma and the surrounding area. I'd also point to the unilateral destruction and dismantling by the aforementioned coalition of internally displaced camps that were havens protected by the UN in North Kivu and South Kivu. Several other cases are worthy of mention, of course. Targeted attacks by way of reprisals against women activists, human rights defenders, sexual and gender-based violence, and attacks against peacekeepers, MONUSCO peacekeepers. We cannot ignore these incidents. In view of the horror and the climate of terror described above, my delegation urges the Council to face the truth. There is an urgent need to rapidly move to the implementation of the provisions of Resolution 2773. An effective cessation of hostilities and de-escalation will not be possible until increased pressure is brought to bear, or until there are more robust sanctions against Rwanda and its M23 AFC allies. Madam President, I would be remiss if I did not recall before your Council that as we meet here, Rwanda has more than half of its army deployed on the territory of the DRC. And this has occurred without the consent of the Congolese state. The right to self-defense cannot be invoked as a justification for an armed invasion, nor for the creation of parallel administrations on the territory of a sovereign state. These acts, in and of themselves, are grave violations of the United Nations Charter, the Constitutive Act of the African Union, and of Resolution 3314 of the UN General Assembly, dated 14th of December 1974. Madam President, it's not my job to recall that when the Council unanimously adopted its Resolution 2773 on the 21st of February, a significant number of Council members stated that they would ensure that it was implemented in its entirety. They stated then that the Council reserved the right to contemplate the imposition of other measures were the resolution not fully implemented. My delegation is of the view that the Council measures envisaged for such circumstances must include a series of sanctions. The most pressing of these are as follows. 1. Due to Rwanda's persistent refusal to comply with Resolution 2773, the Security Council should firmly condemn this blatant violation and consider submitting to the International Court of Justice a request for an advisory opinion in accordance with the provisions of Article 96 of the United Nations Charter. Moreover, the Council should study the implementation of a reinforced mechanism to monitor the implementation of Resolution 2773, with gradually more stringent coercive measures being put in place in the case of continued non-compliance. 2. Establish a regime of sanctions applicable to Rwanda and its leaders. 3. Impose an arms embargo on Rwanda until it ceases its support for M23 and until it totally withdraws its army from the DRC's territory. 3. Call upon the 1533 DRC Sanctions Committee to be guided by Operative Paragraph 9 of Resolution 2773 to implement a gamut of UN sanctions, this in accordance with Resolution 2293 of 2016. Sanctions that should be imposed namely against people thought to be perpetuating conflict in the eastern DRC. 4. Establish a regime of much more severe sanctions to be imposed on M23 AFC, given excessive human rights violations perpetrated in the areas under their occupation. 3. To heed the request made in letters submitted by the DRC to the Security Council and the UN Secretary-General. That letter saw my government call for the withdrawal of Rwanda's status as a TCC contributing to peacekeeping missions of the United Nations, because it is not worthy of that status. Finally, decry and sanction the involvement of Rwandan authorities in the illegal exploitation of natural resources, both mining and agricultural resources, owned by the DRC. Before I conclude, I must reiterate my government's thanks and the thanks of the DRC's people to the states and institutions that have courageously imposed sanctions against Rwanda. This includes the US, the UK, Germany, Canada, the European Union in general, and France, Belgium, Slovenia, and Greece in particular. Finally, we must here recognize that sanctions in the cases of the Great Lakes crisis are not counterproductive. It is for this reason we encourage the Security Council and other peace-loving states to follow suit. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Olivier Nduhungirehe, Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Rwanda.
Madam President, Council members, I thank you for giving me the floor. Allow me to begin by congratulating you on your presidency and leadership over this Council during the month of March 2025. I also acknowledge the contributions of previous speakers and briefers. As a member state of the United Nations and a prominent contributor to peace support mission, Rwanda stands in firm support to peacekeeping and peacekeepers wherever they are and wherever they serve. This is precisely why Rwanda insists on accountability and transparency for all those who are mandated by the UN Security Council to serve the cause of peace. Allow me here to bring more clarity on the conflict in Eastern DRC. This conflict was not started by Rwanda, but the burden has been placed squarely on Rwanda's shoulder. In addition, actions taken by different actors have enabled the DRC to escape its responsibilities, particularly as regards to leadership and governance failures. The root causes of this conflict go back first to the continued preservation of the FDLR genocidal militia, despite its record of ethnic massacres, recruitment of child soldiers, and the stabilization of both Rwanda and the DRC. It is unfortunate that some in the international community conveniently continue to ignore its existence. The recent capture and handover to Rwanda of FDLR members, including a senior commander, has provided even more evidence of how the DRC government integrated FDLR fighters into its national army. Kinshasa gave them weapons, resources, and a platform to continue their genocide ideology. Secondly, the systematic persecution that Congolese Kinyarwanda speakers, particularly Tutsi communities, is linked to colonial legacy. This includes communities in South Kivu and Ituri provinces. Among the consequences of the discrimination, violence, and ethnic cleansing in the DRC are the hundreds of thousands of refugees in Rwanda, Uganda, and other countries in our region that have been living mostly in refugee camps, unable to safely return to their homes for many years. Given the situation, what is to be expected from Rwanda? Why is Rwanda disproportionately targeted? It is not clear. What is clear to us in Rwanda is that the defensive measures we have put in place will remain until there is a credible framework for long-term security guarantees along our border with the DRC. Madam President, the case of MONUSCO has been particularly troubling. as reflected in the report we have just received. There has been a recurrent pattern of MONUSCO's deliberations being used to push a narrative that fails to reflect reality on the ground. Sadly, today's report is no exception. While it accurately cites abusive armed groups like the ADF, Codeco, the Kinshasa-backed FDLR, genocidal militia, and even DRC forces as the main perpetrators of human rights violations, the report continues to single out other actors as the primary cause of instability in Eastern DRC. As such, the report shows a clear pattern of bias in the reporting of the security crisis in that region. MONUSCO's long-standing failure to implement the mandate it was entrusted with 25 years ago, that is the eradication of all armed groups, including the FDLR genocidal militia, which has operated with total impunity in Eastern DRC for the past 3 decades. We cannot hope to achieve peace if the root causes of this crisis are not addressed. I was personally sitting in this council on 28th of March 2013 when Resolution 2098 was adopted to deploy a Force Intervention Brigade, FIB, within MONUSCO, with a specific mandate to neutralize all armed groups, including the FDLR. However, operational focus was exclusively directed at the M23, and MONUSCO FIB refused to neutralize the FDLR, which continued to create havoc in Eastern DRC even today in 2025. In fact, since 2003, this Council has reiterated the need to address the threat of the FDLR through more than 20 different resolutions. Yet, after billions of dollars spent on what remains the UN's most expensive peacekeeping mission in history, meaningful results remain elusive. As a result, Congolese civilians, especially Tutsi, have continued to be targeted for persecution, discrimination, and forced displacement. In October 2023, a whole village, 300 homes of Congolese Tutsi, was burned down by DRC-backed militias in Turo village, Masisi territory. And where was MONUSCO at that time? Since February this year, the Banyamulenge villages in South Kivu, Minembwe, South Kivu, are being bombed by attack drones and fighter jets from DRC. Where is MONUSCO? And there is an issue of governance and political inclusion that needs to be addressed by DRC. Madam President, since the resurgence of hostilities in October 2021, MONUSCO has failed to contribute constructively to the escalation or to peace efforts. More alarmingly, MONUSCO provided direct support to the military operation of the DRC coalition, placing itself in a situation of belligerence, even sometimes fighting alongside the same groups it was created to neutralize. I should here note the presence of European mercenaries in this coalition, those mercenaries who were deployed in violation of a UN Convention of 1989 and who were working alongside the DRC Army and MONUSCO. Rwanda has raised these concerns repeatedly before this Council, but they have never been addressed. SRSG Bintou Keita and MONUSCO have also contributed to the distortion of facts surrounding recent developments. Widely exaggerated claims of 3,000 civilians casualties were circulated by MONUSCO officials following the capture of Goma in January 2025. These figures, contested by journalists and humanitarian workers on the ground, have been weaponized by the government of the DRC to call for punitive measures against Rwanda. And you just heard another sample of fabricated claims by my colleague from DRC. Nonetheless, Rwanda continues to believe that MONUSCO can still change its course and play a positive role, provided that it abides by its mandate to protect civilians, ensure humanitarian assistance, and possibly providing logistical support to the joint EAC SADC efforts currently under discussion. Madam President, since the last briefing in December 2024 and the fall of Goma, there is a new momentum for peace in the region. The first ever EAC SADC summit took place on 8th February 2025 in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The joint summit, whose outcomes were endorsed by the African Union, decided to merge the Luanda and Nairobi processes. It was a merger, not a harmonization as heard in this council. And the summit also renewed the call for a cessation of hostilities and inclusive political dialogue. This dialogue will be guided by an enlarged panel of 5 facilitators from across Africa under the stewardship of the African Union chairperson. Rwanda welcomes and fully supports these developments. In particular, we welcome the recent decision of the AFC M23 to reposition its forces from Walikale in support of peace initiatives underway, as well as the DRC's announcement that all offensive operations by FRDC and Wazalendo will be halted. We further urge the international community and the Security Council to support this African-led process. To conclude, Madam President, I would like to reiterate that for the last 31 years, Rwanda has worked hard to build unity, reconciliation, stability, and economic growth to promote the rights of vulnerable groups across the board. A sustainable political solution with long-term security guarantees for Rwanda will allow us to get back to the serious and urgent work of developing our country and integrating our region together with our neighbors. Rwanda has always wanted a lasting political and security settlement for the region. In this regard, we are committed to working with all parties to ensure that we stick to commitments made, particularly the joint EAC SADC summit process and other complementary confidence-building initiatives. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Rwanda, and I now give the floor to the representative of Angola.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, allow us, first of all, to salute you, Madam President, for organizing this debate on the situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, and the work carried out by United Nations Stabilization Mission in DRC, MONUSCO. We welcome the presence of His Excellency Oliver Ndungire, Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of the Republic of Rwanda, and His Excellency Ambassador Zanon Mukongo Ngai, Permanent Representative of DRC to the United Nations. We will also welcome Burundi's participation in this meeting. We thank the Honorable Madame Bintou Keita, Special Representative of UN Secretary General for the DRC and Head of MONUSCO, for presenting the relevant report of the Secretary General of MONUSCO. We share the concerns expressed in the political, defense and security, protection of civilians and human rights fields, and take note of the observations contained in the report. We will also avail the opportunity to welcome the participation of Ms. Charlotte Slent, Secretary General of the Danish Refugee Council. Madam President, Angola remains very concerned about the situation in eastern DRC and the continued advance and consequent occupation of territory by M23. These actions, which are occurring despite ongoing regional and international efforts towards a political and negotiated solution to the conflict, compromise peace and stability in DRC, puts its sovereignty and integrity at risk, worsen the humanitarian situation, and threaten security in the Great Lakes regions and on the continent. In the meantime, this Council, on the 21st February, unanimously adopted Resolution 2773, which strongly condemns the offensive by M23 in the North and South Kivu provinces of DRC, urged it to immediately cease hostilities, withdraw from areas it controls, and fully reverse the establishment of a legitimate parallel administration in that country's territory. Madam President, allow us to highlight 2 points about the situation in DRC. First, achievements of mediation mandate by the African Union. In May 2022, the African Union, AU, mandated His Excellency João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço, President of the Republic of Angola, as President of the International Conference on the Great Lakes Region, to mediate the political crisis between DRC and Rwanda. At the end of several rounds of negotiations, by December 2024, the Luanda process had already recorded notable progress, which must be preserved within the framework of efforts to achieve peace and stability in the Eastern DRC. An Angola-DRC-Rwanda tripartite presidential summit was scheduled for 15 December in Luanda, Angola, with the aim of finalizing and consolidating the peace agreement. However, this ended up not happening due to a disagreement regarding the resolution of the M23 issue, as Rwanda insisted that it be addressed, while the DRC considered it did not fit into the framework of the Luanda process. It should be noted that the progress achieved under the Luanda process create a new dynamic and urgency in advancing the Nairobi process, a diplomatic mechanism responsible for addressing issues related to the different armed groups operating in DRC, including M23. Angola has always believed in the need, in parallel with efforts to normalize relations between DRC and Rwanda, to also take place direct negotiations between the government of DRC and the M23 as part of the peace process. With full consent and in coordination with both parties, Angola mediation created the condition for the first round of direct talks to take place in Luanda on 18 March. However, at the last minute, such meeting did not take place due to several factors, some of them external and foreign to an African solution to this conflict. Second, relevance of the Luanda and Nairobi process. The understanding reached to date within the framework of the Luanda process constitute a solid and comprehensive political basis capable of advancing efforts to promote peace in Eastern DRC. The EU Commission recognized that the Luanda process has contributed significantly to creating conditions for dialogue and regional and international engagement, offering a valuable platform for fostering mutual understanding in pursuit of peace, security, and stability in Eastern DRC. Within this renewed attention and international engagement that the situation requires, particularly at the level of this Council, Angola considers to have fulfilled the essential part of the mandate given by the AU to facilitate the resolution of the crisis between the DRC and Rwanda. Almost 2 months after assuming the pro tempore presidency of the African Union, His Excellency João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço, President of the Republic of Angola, feels the need to dedicate himself fully to the priorities of the continental agenda, which include issues of peace and security. Madam President, for Angola, the strict observance of the ceasefire agreed between the parties, the immediate cessation of all hostilities, the implementation of concepts of operation of the harmonized plan for the neutralization of the FDLR and the lifting of Rwanda defensive measures, and the deployment of reinforced verification mechanisms constitute fundamental steps towards a peaceful resolution of the conflict in Eastern DRC. We welcome the ongoing regional efforts at the level of the Southern Africa Development Community, SADC, and the East African Community, EAC, and the diplomatic initiatives aimed at achieving lasting peace in Eastern DRC. In conclusion, Angola recognized the importance of diplomatic initiatives by the United Nations, other international bodies, and countries of goodwill that are interested in contributing to the consolidation of the progress and supporting ongoing efforts for a peaceful resolution of the crisis in DRC, as long as these are aligned and coordinate with the AU agenda in the spirit of African solutions to African problems. In this regard, we reaffirm the position of the African Union Commission that all initiatives should be designed to complement and reinforce existing Africa-led mechanisms, ensuring coherence, ownership, and effectiveness in addressing the challenges prevailing in the continent. Angola takes this opportunity to reaffirm its engagement to continue working with all stakeholders and sharing its political experience as part of regional and international efforts aimed at resolving the conflict in the Eastern DRC. As the African Union champion for peace and reconciliation in Africa and chair of the African Union, His Excellency João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço, President of the Republic of Angola, will continue to be committed to mobilizing African initiatives and international assistance to achieve peace and stability in Africa. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Angola for the statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Burundi.
Je vous remercie, Madame.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I would like to thank Denmark for convening this important meeting of the Security Council. We'd also like to extend our gratitude to the UN Secretary General for his detailed report on the situation in the DRC and on the work that MONUSCO is doing. The SG's report sheds light on the major challenges the region is facing. The report is an essential instrument guiding our collective action. We welcome, Madam President, the presence of Ms. Bintou Keita. We underscore that Ms. Keita's stellar work, as well as the remarkable work being done by all MONUSCO personnel to discharge its mandate, is laudable. We welcome the participation of Ms. Charlotte Slente, Secretary General of the Danish Refugee Council, in this meeting. Thank you for your laudable efforts geared towards assisting refugees in the Great Lakes region. In particular, we'd like to commend the participation in this session of His Excellency Mr. Olivier Nduhungirehe, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Rwanda, as well as our colleagues from the DRC and Angola. My delegation welcomes the detailed briefings delivered to us this morning. They highlight the major challenges and the current tensions in the DRC. We reiterate our unswerving support to MONUSCO as it implements its mandate. At the same time, we would like to underscore that it is only a comprehensive political solution, as well as close regional cooperation, that will be able to put an end to the current crisis and achieve lasting peace in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In light of the situation in the east of the DRC, we would like to make the following remarks. First, we'd like to speak to humanitarian concerns and human rights violations. Burundi welcomes the sustained efforts undertaken by the Secretary-General of the United Nations and by the Security Council with a view to maintaining peace and stability in the Great Lakes region. Nonetheless, the humanitarian situation in the east of the DRC remains alarming. We're seeing growing humanitarian suffering, the suffering of civilians, and this calls for immediate and concrete measures to be taken. The reports drafted by the Secretary-General, Security Council resolutions, as well as the report of the Human Rights Council, note alarming levels of sexual violence, as well as serious violations of the rights of women, children, and older persons who are the most vulnerable in this conflict context. Burundi calls for stepped-up action so as to protect these vulnerable people and to guarantee their security and dignity, in keeping with the principles of international humanitarian law. Murders, abductions, and sexual violence are being inflicted on civilians. These amount to serious violations of human rights and must be staunchly condemned. My second point is support for Resolution 2773 of the Security Council. Over a month has passed since Resolution 2773 was adopted by the Security Council on the 21st of February. The resolution demanded the immediate end of the M23 offensive, as well as the withdrawal of Rwandan forces and of the M23 from Goma, Bukavu, and from all areas under their control, as well as the effective implementation of this resolution remains wanting. The Security Council is duty-bound to do everything it can to ensure the implementation of 2773 on the situation in the DRC, because the resolutions of this august body are legally binding. Non-compliance with these resolutions risks weakening the authority of this council, which is enshrined in the United Nations Charter. They could also perpetuate impunity in the Eastern DRC. This council has the means and the tools to make sure its resolutions are implemented. Burundi would also like to deplore the fact that the M23 offensive is continuing despite multiple calls for peace emanating from SADC, the EAC, ECAS, and from the EAC SADC. We've heard these over the course of the last 2 months. Burundi urges all parties to fully respect their commitments, to revert to the path of dialogue, and to take concrete and measurable action on the ground so as to achieve a lasting political solution. This brings me to my third point: regional initiatives. The ECAS, EAC, and SADC regional initiatives have all involved a call for an immediate ceasefire and for the reopening of humanitarian corridors and airports. These are commendable. Burundi also welcomes the recent report issued following the joint meeting of chiefs of defense, the chiefs of defense of the EAC SADC, as well as the proposed roadmap. Nevertheless, we'd like to recall that this roadmap should also take into consideration the disengagement and withdrawal of uninvited forces present in the DRC, as well as the disarmament of armed groups. Burundi would like to express its gratitude to the President of Angola. We're grateful for his efforts within the framework of the Luanda process. We remain convinced, firmly so, that African solutions and African mediation efforts are the most appropriate way of solving African problems. Any initiative that can contribute to lasting peace in the Eastern DRC, complementing the Luanda and Nairobi processes, which are on their way to being merged, any such initiative is welcome, although it is no substitute for existing processes. With this in mind, Burundi calls for an inter-Congolese dialogue that is inclusive. I'd like to highlight that. Without any meddling, in which all stakeholders would actively commit themselves to genuine and lasting peace. We also call for all armed groups, local and foreign, to be disbanded, and for the latter to be repatriated to their countries of origin. Fourth, illegal exploitation of natural resources. This issue, that is the illicit exploitation of natural resources, remains one of the main drivers of conflict in the region. Burundi fully supports the regional initiative on the part of the International Conference of the Great Lakes region, geared towards combating this corrosive practice. We call for enhanced cooperation between the states concerned, so as to eradicate this phenomenon, which foments violence and instability throughout the region. Fifth, the humanitarian impact of the crisis on Burundi. My country, Burundi, owing to its geographical proximity to the affected areas, is being directly beset by the consequences of this deadly invasion. Since the joint summit held on the 8th of February, Burundi has welcomed over 60,000 Congolese refugees seeking protection. As things stand, over 120,000 refugees are being housed in camps located throughout Burundi, exerting growing pressure on limited resources. Burundi urgently appeals to regional and international solidarity so as to confront this humanitarian crisis. 6. Our commitment to a lasting political solution. Burundi would like to reiterate its commitment to seeking a lasting political solution to the conflict in the DRC, in keeping with the peace plan put forward by the government of my country. We stand convinced that in the face of civilian suffering and mass violations of international humanitarian law and human rights, we must accept that it is high time to move from fine words to concrete deeds. By way of conclusion, Madam President, the international community must step up its efforts so as to ensure respect for the national sovereignty and the territorial integrity of the DRC, and to do this through the effective implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 2773, as well as the other various measures that regional actors have already undertaken. Non-respect for the territorial integrity of the DRC could set a dangerous precedent. A dangerous precedent which some states could make use of to nibble at portions of the territory of other sovereign states. I thank you.
For the statement. The representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I didn't wish to take the floor at this stage, but I've just listened to Rwanda's statement, and as such I'm tempted to ask whether we're all, in fact, on the planet Earth. Do we all live here? Because you will have noted that Rwanda is putting forward the same arguments, the hackneyed arguments regarding the origins of the conflict, despite the fact it's been established here that Rwanda is the origin of the conflict. It didn't begin with it didn't begin with the FDLR. The conflict began in Rwanda. It's a Rwandan conflict, and it began before the genocide. The genocide began with the killing of President Abdurrahman. That's the origin of the current conflict. And it played out in Rwanda between the Rwandans. We need to look for the roots of the killing of that president, because that's where the conflict began. Secondly, argument linked to the FDLR and the genocide. That's an outdated argument, a hackneyed one again. Here, a Rwandan ambassador clearly stated that the FDLR phenomenon is no longer a threat to Rwanda because the FDLR have been practically rooted out entirely. That was said here. However, we said, if that's the case, okay, we will contribute to the operation ironing out the FDLR. But if that didn't happen, well, it's Rwanda's fault. They confused everything. Regarding the persecution of the Tutsis, we've always seen knives being shoved around, twisted in the wounds. There's always frustration because the genocide occurred in Rwanda between the Rwandan people, but we see genocide everywhere. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is a country with 450 ethnic groups, but Rwanda only has 2 ethnic groups. So the Rwandan conflict cannot be transposed onto the DRC. It's not logical for us to target or target one ethnic group when we have 450. I did take the floor, Madam President, to react to the insulting stance adopted by Rwanda against the United Nations and MONUSCO. We can't understand Rwanda as a TCC denigrating throughout the whole day UN reports saying that Rwanda is invading the territory of the DRC, including the fact that they're perpetrating grave violations of human rights. That's what MONUSCO has reported to us here. We can't understand that Rwanda, as a TCC, is slandering these reports, besmirching MONUSCO's work, but nevertheless welcomes the fact that Rwandan nationals are appointed by the Secretary-General to senior positions in the United Nations. And at the same time, they're delighted to be a TCC to the United Nations, despite the fact that they never accept a single report that it issues. That's what I wanted to come back to, Madam President. I remain here. I'll stop there, and I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo for the statement. His Excellency the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Rwanda has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. 2 points. I'd like to raise 2 points. First, the origins of the conflict. It's true that in 11 days we will be commemorating the 31st anniversary of the genocide perpetrated by the Tutsis in Rwanda. We have a population of 7.5 million and over 1 million people perished. The army, the militias who committed this genocide, they went to what was called the ex-Zaire, which is now the DRC. This movement, these groups, in fact, which are now called the FDLR, were maintained, supported, funded by successive governments in ex-Zaire and the DRC. Just a few days ago, Ezekiel Gakwere, a general leading a brigade, he participated in a genocide in Rwanda. He even participated in the assassination of the last queen of Rwanda, and he was handed over to us. And he was in an FARDC uniform collaborating with the Congolese army. So when I'm told that the FDLR no longer exist, when they're actually very active and they're been incorporated into the DRC's army. So I'm not really sure what planet my colleague lives on to take his words. Moving on to territorial integrity. This is a tenet of international law. it wasn't invented by the DRC. It also applies to Rwanda. Since 2018, we've seen over 20 attacks perpetrated by the FDLR and by other groups, including the FARDC, on our territory. There were attacks in 2018 by the FLN. They killed 9 people, including a 13-year-old girl, Ornella, and Isaac, a 17-year-old boy. In 2019, in October, attacks were perpetrated by the FDLR. 15 people lost their lives. In 2022, same again. During the battle for Goma, 200 houses were attacked by the Congolese army, launching their attack from the airport in Goma. So when we talk about territorial integrity, that applies to all countries across the board. Rwanda was the victim. Its sovereignty and territorial integrity was violated on numerous occasions by the FARDC. That's what I wanted to say, Madam President. Thank you.
I believe the Council has now had the opportunity to hear perspectives of all participants several times. With this in mind, we close the speakers list now. There are no more names inscribed of the list of speakers. I now invite the Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion of the subject. The meeting is adjourned.